You are listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96 with Melinda Francis, Norman Richmond. Elise Watson is on the buttons, and we just heard from Tien Providence and the Jazz Zone, and he did a great tribute. Did a great show per usual. And joining us on the line is Dr. Gerald Horne, the author of about 40, 50 books. And we are going to kick it with Dr. Horne for about a half an hour. I'm going to let Melinda Francis kick off the show.
Yeah, this is, Trump a revolutionary per the New York Times Economist articles?
Well, it's rather remarkable. Probably be more remarkable to future historians, assume that we survive nuclear war and climate change. The ability or lack thereof of many of these bourgeois analysts to figure out what's going on in the United States of America. With Mr. Trump now seeking to destroy the university sector, particularly the elite university sector, by stripping them of federal funds, by him going after law firms and getting them to contribute free legal services to his favorite causes, with him going after the media, forcing the ouster, objectively at least, executive producer of 60 Minutes, which has been a popular TV show on CBS for years and decades, with regard to his seeking to remove embassies and consulates from Africa, which reputedly has brought a smile to many faces in China, which feels they will have less competition on that important continent. I could go on in this vein, but in any case, come to the conclusion that Mr. Trump is a revolutionary. that is their conclusion. And I would particularly refer you to the column by New York Times columnist David Brooks in the last 24 to 48 hours, which lays out the case for Mr. Trump as a revolutionary. I would argue, of course, alternatively, that Mr. Trump is actually a counter-revolutionary, and that in this, he represents a long and determined trend in the trajectory of the United States of America. The tragedy is that the U.S.left has not arrived at this conclusion, and so therefore they are not able to provide the guidance and leadership that is so desperately needed at this fraught moment, because many of them have drunk the Kool-Aid and they continue to speak in hushed and reverent tones about the alleged revolution of 1776, even though we know that a motive force for this so-called revolution was the fact that Britain had decided that it did not want to continue to expend blood and treasure in fighting Native Americans, so that land speculators like George Washington, a lineal, or I should say a lateral ancestor of the current real estate speculator Donald Trump in the White House, so that these real estate speculators can profit. And then, of course, as I've sought to point out in a number of works, there was the impetus in London that seemed to suggest that Britain was moving towards the abolition of slavery. And despite the protestations of many of our friends on the left that actually 1776 had the seeds of abolition, the fact is that there were thousands of enslaved Africans in 1776 and millions by 1861 on the verge of the U.S. Civil War. So I'd hate to see a Republican project, so-called, that embodied anti-abolition if this was abolitionism. And as we know, I then published a book, The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery in U.S. and Jim Crow and the Roots of U.S. Fascism. I'm about to publish a book next year, The Counter-Revolution of 1893, The Hawaii Coup and the Roots of U.S. Imperialism in the Asia-Pacific Basin. And I think it's fair to say that because there is this popular idea that this country was born a revolution, when there is radical change, the kind of change we're experiencing today, with residents of the United States being shipped to hellhole-like prisons in El Salvador, with Mr. Trump promising and pledging that next in line will be, quote, homegrowns, unquote. That is to say, persons like myself who were born here could conceivably be shipped to hellholes of prisons in El Salvador. The only vocabulary that seems to be available is to look at this as revolutionary change, which obviously represents a profound misreading of not only the process that led to the formation of the United States, it's a profound misreading of settler colonialism, that system that now obtains in the United States of America, which is based upon class collaboration, which helps to explain why 77 million people voted for a felon and a coup plotter for president in November 2024. And I think as well that it obviously shapes political strategy, because if you don't see Mr. Trump as a counter-revolutionary, then you don't see the need that our ancestors perceived of lengthening the battlefield to fight a counter-revolutionary process that has mass support yesterday and today. That would mean, for example, helping to organize sanctions against the Trump regime. For example, helping to extend the tourism boycott, which I'm happy to say in many ways was birthed in Canada, with Canadians refusing to take these tours to Florida and Arizona, and is now spreading like wildfire across the globe almost spontaneously. But we don't have a movement that would see extending that tourism boycott and the question of sanctions against the Trump regime as being a prominent part of political strategy. Likewise, as you know, I've been trumpeting this African Union Caribbean Community Summit, the latter embracing Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, etc. The summit taking place in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia in September 2025, and seeking to place on that agenda many anti-Trump elements. But if you don't see the United States as a counter-revolutionary project, but if you see it as actually a revolutionary project, you don't see the necessity and need for lengthening the battlefield. But the good news is that as I sift through the tea leaves, I perceive that there is a global anti-Trump movement that is developing. We might have seen that a few days ago when there was a dumping of U.S. Treasury bills. It still remains unclear who led the charge. Some say it was Japan. Some say it were hedge fund operators on Wall Street seeking to make a pretty penny despite their support for Mr. Trump. The latest scuttlebutt is that the European Union and European countries, besides, including Britain and Norway, that are not part of the EU, engineered this monumental effort to crimp the style of Mr. Trump, which caused him to cause a pause, a 90-day pause, he says, with regard to his tariff war. Recall that these 5 European Union nations plus Britain and Norway, they have about 2 trillion plus, almost $3 trillion that they have loaned to the United States government, more than Japan, which is usually touted as the #1 lender to the United States. And obviously, they have a lot of leverage when it comes to pressuring the United States. And in that regard, if Mr. Trump decides to do a 180 with regard to his policy concerning Russia and Ukraine, which may be in motion, it's still hard to say because Mr. Trump is so erratic. I infer from his recent criticisms of Russia and Mr. Putin personally that could be in the cards. If that is in the cards, it's probably a reflection of the arm twisting by the Europeans, which may have taken place indeed just yesterday at the funeral of His Holiness in Italy, speaking of the Pope. In any case, I think that we desperately need in this country, and I would argue worldwide, more detailed and indeed more accurate historical analyses that would help to prepare us for this fraught and perilous moment that we're facing. And once again, as I've said before, I would hope that some of these analyses could come from Canada, the northern neighbor. Neighbors oftentimes tend to know their neighbors more and better than most. Canada lives next door to the United States. It has become a staunch and trenchant critic of the United States that it might even affect the outcome of the Canadian elections tomorrow. We'll be back next Sunday with an analysis of those elections and what they portend for the future of not only Canadian imperialism, but U.S. imperialism.
You are listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96, and I am dying to hear your thoughts on tomorrow's elections in Canada, also the elections in Australia. I think they're taking place on May 3rd. Could you talk about the discernible trends?
Well, first of all, with regard to both of these elections, they're very important to study for those interested in U.S. imperialism, because we know that the colony that was then Canada, mostly Quebec, did not revolt against British rule in 1776. Australia, of course, has its origins in 1788 because London and the Crown was looking for another site to dump its prisoners and malcontents after losing what had become the United States of America as a result of their loss of that colony in 1783. And there are many commonalities, as we know, between the United States, Canada, and Australia. You need look no further than the fact that many of the most influential movie stars in Hollywood, thought of as the preeminent U.S. industry, actually have their roots in Canada and Australia. I'm thinking of Nicole Kidman of Australia. I'm thinking of Errol Flynn, who actually has roots in Tasmania, the island off the southern coast of Australia, which I'm afraid to say represents the most horrible excesses of settler colonialism insofar as the settlers began to hunt and shoot down the indigenous people like they were hunting and shooting down wolves in the western part of the United States in the 19th century. And of course, we all know about the man who started and is still leading Saturday Night Live, having roots in Canada, Michael Myers, who's done the comic, who's done advertisements with Liberal Party leader Mark Carney, roots in Canada, et cetera. And so the trend seems to be that the Trump-like candidates in Australia and in Canada are losing. I'm speaking of Peter Dutton in Australia, the conservative former cop. One of his top aides has adopted and adapted the slogan of MAGA, Make Australia Great Again. You have Pierre Poilievre, who is the Trump-like candidate in Canada, the leader of the Canadian right wing, who has expressed sympathy for the so-called Freedom Convoy, which was very dangerous when it sought to shut down Ottawa, the capital, because of objections to the COVID policies of then Prime Minister Mr. Trudeau. The problem that the conservatives have in this election tomorrow, which has been dominated by a discourse about Mr. Trump's attempt to annex Canada, turning it into the 51st state, is that there is a significant percentage of the conservatives who are actually in favor of U.S. annexation. That might include the leader of the province of Alberta, the Texas of Canada. And I might say that that compromises the ability of the conservative leadership to denounce Mr. Trump, which I think has led to the fact that they had, as recently as 10 weeks ago, a double-digit lead in the polls, and now they're expected to lose tomorrow. We shall see. We'll know by next Sunday. But in any case, that could be good news, because oftentimes the kind of fascism that we see creeping on little cat feet in the United States is part of a global trend. And so if the ultra right wing does not prevail in Australia, does not prevail in Canada, that'll be a good sign for anti-fascists here in the United States of America. Although, of course, we can not ignore the fact that in upcoming elections in the UK, Nigel Farage has a friendly familiarity with alcoholic beverages and is a close comrade of Mr. Trump. His party, the so-called Reform Party, is challenging the Tories, the conservatives from the right. They're expected to do well. We all know that the Nazi-curious Alternative for Germany party in the Federal Republic of Germany did quite well in the most recent elections. We all know about Prime Minister Maloney, who is a frequent visitor to Washington, not least because of her close friendship with Elon Musk. Her party is a neo-fascist party. And in fact, she was even welcomed warmly into the Oval Office by Mr. Biden, despite the fact that Mr. Biden is heavily dependent upon Black votes, and despite the fact that Prime Minister Maloney's government is perhaps the most anti-African government in Europe, which is really saying something. But alas, because much of the Black leadership does not necessarily pay attention to what's going on beyond the borders of this country, that and so much else has passed them by, which is one of the reasons why we desperately need, shall we say euphemistically, a renewal of the leadership in the Black community in the United States. But alas, it does not seem to be in the offing.
Dr. Horne, let me ask you this question. That was a close comrade of mine who's no longer in the land of the living, by the name of Greg Quill. He was a Euro. He was born in New Zealand. And he argued, his argument was that New Zealand, unlike Australia, their left was stronger than it was in Australia, that they had actually supported, came out against, apartheid and supported the left. The left had supported progressive movements around the world, including Africa and the Caribbean. Is that true or not?
Well, certainly New Zealand is more progressive than Australia, which I'm not sure that says too much, but it is a fact. That is to say, I oftentimes compare New Zealand and Australia to New Mexico and Arizona, bordering states in the U.S. Southwest, where Arizona tends to lean to the right. Their next door neighbor, New Mexico, tends to lean to the left. However, I would say with regard to the nation we now call New Zealand, that one of the reasons why it is leaned to the left turns on a very simple fact. Recall my referring to the invasion of the continent known as Australia in 1788, followed about 5 or 6 decades later by the invasion of the nation we now call New Zealand. By the time that second invasion took place, the indigenous population, the Maori population, was able to steel themselves. They were very good warriors, very good at trench warfare, and therefore they were able to fight back more effectively than their indigenous comrades across the Tasman in Australia. And I think that that helps to explain in a material sense why New Zealand, or the country we call New Zealand, I have to keep saying, is more progressive, not least because the indigenous community, which is now about 13 to 14% of the population. When I visited there some years ago, I was struck by the fact that on government buildings, that the signs were in English and in an indigenous language, or in the indigenous languages, for example. And that has opened the door for a more rational, humane immigration policy. into the smaller neighbor, speaking of the country we refer to as New Zealand. And I would also say the U.S. imperialism probably has had more influence in Australia, not least because there's a certain simpatico with regard to the right wing. Although contradicting what I just said is the fact that perhaps the most influential labor leader in the United States in the 20th century, speaking of Harry Bridges, who led the San Francisco General Strike of 1934, a founder of the West Coast Longshore Union, was well born in Melbourne, Australia. And of course, he fought back vigorously against attempts to deport him because of allegations that he was an underground member of the U.S. Communist Party.
One last thing on Australia. Isn't it true that the great comedian Franklin Ajayi, I think he has Sierra Leone background, but he grew up in Los Angeles. He spent some time in Australia. He might even still be there.
Oh, is that right? He's still in Australia. It's still down under.
No. I don't know where he is. I know he lived in Australia for a long time. He might. I don't know where he is now. I know he was always one of my favorite comedians. He was. I always saw him as he played in Car Wash. Had a great scene role in Car Wash. I always thought he was hilarious.
Mm-hmm. Well, just as a personal note, I visited both New Zealand, the country we call New Zealand, and Australia. And in the latter country, I did research for my book, Race War, White Supremacy and the Japanese Attack on the British Empire. Research in Canberra, the capital, Melbourne, Sydney, all the way out to the West Coast in Perth, which is not far distant from Indonesia. And I don't know how to phrase this, but just recently, when the U.S. Naval Academy, which trains admirals in Annapolis, Maryland, purged their library of books. Of course, they kept books by Hitler. One of the books purged was my book, Race War, interestingly enough.
Right. Yeah, last thing about Franklin Ajayi, he went to Dorsey High School, which was kind of a middle, as you know, Los Angeles is, that was kind of on the west side of Los Angeles. So there were, Eric Dolphy had gone there. Yeah, Eric Dolphy and Eric Dolphy had a background. I think his mother was from Costa Rica and his father was from Panama. But, Franklin went to Dorsey, and so did my cousin Hardy, all of my cousins, Hardy, Jimmy, and Ross, Jimmy, and Donald. They all went to Dorsey. Next question, Melinda.
Yeah, let's hit this identity politics and Zionism.
Well, I don't hear the term identity politics that much in Canada, although in the Globe and Mail, the Toronto newspaper, a week or so ago, a commentator wrote a piece on what he called identity politics, and he was upbraiding CBC, Canadian Broadcasting, for engaging in such. But what's interesting about the invocation of that term, he did not define what he meant by that. Of course, he did not mention Zionism, which could be considered the highest form of identity politics. After all, it's an conservative ideology that has led directly to genocide in Gaza. For example, it's exclusivist. It's based upon an ethno-religious, narrow political project, for example. He did not include Zionism in his denunciation. And of course, he did not include the nationalism of the Quebecois, as you know, more than most, in the election tomorrow and in the debates that took place, the English language debate and the French language debate. Of course, they're the leaders of the major parties, the liberals, the conservatives, the New Democratic Party, and of course, the Bloc Quebecois, which only campaigns in Quebec. And if you ask the Bloc Quebecois if they are into identity politics, I'm sure they would say, you're damn right. We're protecting the identity of the French-speaking people. As a matter of fact, there was just a controversy in Montreal where the buses were forced to remove this banner that was run electronically on the front of the bus, hailing the chances in the National Hockey League playoffs of their local hockey team. It said something like, "Go Canadians, go," or "Go Habs, go." And
Right.
for a while, it was removed because you're not supposed to use English language like that on the bus. They say, put up some French, man. What's wrong with you? And so I find it curious that when people talk about identity politics, they have a very narrow and circumscribed definition. I guess they're talking about Black nationalism. You never know, because they're not honest enough to define the term that they're using. I guess it must be some sort of like a secret handshake. Everybody knows what you're talking about when you say identity politics, although I'm not sure if that's the best way to win adherents, speaking in vague and nebulous terms. And as I said, I'm happy to say here in Canada, I don't hear that term identity politics as much as I hear it in the United States of America, which is another feather in the cap of Canada in terms of their contestation with the United States of America.
We only have a few seconds, about 3 minutes left. I really want to get your take on the NBA playoffs.
Well, the Lakers, of course, are in a dogfight. The LA with Minnesota Timberwolves, of course, the Lakers started off in Minnesota. That's why they're called the Lakers, not because there's some sort of resonance with LA. It's because of Minnesota being the state of 10,000 lakes. And the LA Clippers are in a dogfight with the Denver Nuggets. It's up and down. My Houston Rockets are in a dogfight with the Golden State Warriors. It's up and down. Cleveland is doing quite well, given a real pasting to the Miami Heat. Boston is in a dogfight with the Orlando Magic, believe it or not. Oklahoma City is really dusting the Memphis Grizzlies. It would not surprise me if it came down to a championship battle between Oklahoma City and your fellow Canadian, SGA, who may be the MVP of the league, and the Cleveland Cavaliers, for example. And I just read an article about the center of the Cleveland Cavaliers, Jared Allen, who is a real reader. Every city they play in, he goes to the biggest bookstore and leaves with a bunch of books. I was very happy to read about a basketball player being a kind of intellectual.
I guess he's like our brother from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I met the brother. He's a coach for this. He plays center for the for San Francisco for what's the brother's name, my friend? You know what I'm talking about.
I know who you're talking about. I can't remember his name either. But
yes,
he was very close to he's from the Grenadines, as I recall.
It's St. Vincent and the Grenadines, right? Yeah. Yeah. I have a picture. I took pictures with him, and when he came to Ralph Gonzalez, and he came. A lot of the Vincentians came to Canada. Ralph Gonzalez and this brother, the center. He's currently the coach of the of Oakland's basketball team.
Oh, he's the Warriors now.
Yeah. The Steph Curry's team, right? Yeah. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I was just trying to find this name. I don't like to leave the audience in the dark. Adonal Foyle.
Adonal Foyle, yes, sir. I think he's from the Grenadines. He's T.N. Providence, who does the Jazz Zone every week. He's from St. Vincent and the Grenadines, right? But Adonal Foyle is the Grenadines. Adonal Foyle is from the Grenadines. He's not from the major island, I guess St. Vincent, right? St. Vincent. Have you ever been to St. Vincent, sir?
No, I have not. He was adopted by Jay Mandel, who, of course, is a noted left-wing professor at Colgate University, where Adonal Foyle matriculated and started on the basketball team. And by the way, Adam Clayton Powell, the late congressman from Harlem, also attended Colgate University.
Mm-hmm. Well, Donald Foyle was known for being, I guess he's one of the intellectual giant when it comes to, I guess there are quite a few. There are quite a few basketball players that are intellects, but I don't think they're not really talked about that much. You know, the stereotypical black athlete. I guess what is it? What was the book called? The $40 Million Slave.
Yep. But add Jared Allen of the Cleveland Cavaliers to your list. And as a matter of fact, I've started rooting for that team because of him.
I'm going to check him out. Yes, sir. And thank you very much, Dr. Horne.
Good luck to you.
And I'd like to thank Lisa Watson for her technical expertise, her brilliance, keeping us on time and keeping us sounding, making me sound like I have some sense. Melinda doesn't need her assistance. And I'd like to let Melinda Francis conclude our show.
Yeah, I'm for a win next week.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.